Joining us on the line is Giancarlo Sopo. He's a conservative media strategist and writer, helped lead the Trump re-election campaign, Hispanic communication effort. The Trump campaign obviously overperformed with regard to Hispanics. That's particularly true in Texas and Florida. Giancarlo, thanks so much for joining the show.
Hey, Ben, great to be with you.
So let's start with the obvious question. What did Trump do right with regard to the Latino vote in particularly Florida and Texas? Why did that differ in terms of Arizona and California? Maybe you can explain some of these sort of complicating factors.
Yeah, so I think it's very interesting. We had a very robust campaign really throughout the country, and in Florida, President Trump's strong message of his opposition to socialism and his very strong economy and economic record really resonated with Hispanics in South Florida and in Central Florida also. So, for example, he gained 11 points with Puerto Ricans in Central Florida, which nobody saw coming. And in South Florida, he reassembled the conservative coalition, which had historically relied upon the historic exile generation of Cuban Americans. And it now includes young Cuban Americans, so people like me, but also newer Cuban arrivals, along with Colombians, Peruvians, and Venezuelans. So it was that combination of like having a very strong economic record and taking a very strong stance against socialism, while at the same time, the Democrats had just, at least at the leadership level, had embraced these neo-Marxists who had hijacked the party. And that alienated an entire generation of Cuban Americans and other Latinos in Florida. And it didn't also help with Puerto Ricans. Joe Biden had a very poor record on Puerto Rico, and we communicated that to the Boricuas who live in Florida and in other places like Philadelphia as well.
Well, it really is interesting when we talk about the Hispanic vote. It's treated by the media as monolithic. And as you mentioned, it is far from monolithic. There's a big difference between folks who came from Venezuela or who came from Cuba and folks who are immigrating from Mexico in terms of what their prior political situation was, what maybe their worldview is. If you came from a hardcore communist/socialist country like Cuba or Venezuela, you're probably going to have a different view of socialism than if you came from a country like Mexico, for example.
Yeah, but you know what, though? What was really fascinating about these election results is that there are about 9 counties in Texas that are 90% or more Hispanic, and these are overwhelmingly Mexican American. And in these counties, President Trump gained 13 points relative to 2016. In fact, my analysis is almost done. It seems like he may be the Republican with the highest percentage ever in these counties, with the exception of George W. Bush in 2004, meaning that he achieved a higher share of the vote in those Texas counties than Governor George Bush did in 2000, which is really fascinating. I've also been taking a look at the data in other states like New Mexico and in California, and it seems like his gains in those states were slightly smaller. So I think in New Mexico, in New Mexico's majority Hispanic counties, he gained about 4 points, and in California's majority Hispanic counties, he gained about 1.6 percentage points. But the California case is interesting because there are so many Latinos there, but neither side really had a strong campaign in California. Nobody buys a lot of local TV there or does a lot of GOTV efforts. So, those states are not going to move as much. But in the battleground states, we saw significant movement, and I found that really fascinating.
Now, Giancarlo, how much of this had to do with the specific appeal of President Trump, and how much of it had to do with the fact that the Democratic Party alienated so many Hispanic and Latino voters, namely through their embrace of socialism in certain respects, but also through their sort of myopic focus on things like Black Lives Matter and the suggestion that there is no progress available to people who are of minority persuasion?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Ben. So as far as what the Democrats did wrong, at first, it doesn't help the fact that the Democrats have now decided to call Hispanics Latinx, which is a term that no Hispanic identifies with. So there's a sort of like cultural wokeness that just doesn't really resonate in Latino culture, which is certainly not woke. I mean, that's not how we are. And then in these, particularly like in these border counties where we saw some of President Trump's strongest gains with Latinos, the Democrats have just abandoned any kind of position on border security. And that actually matters to these communities. Look, when you're a rich guy like Jorge Ramos at Univision in Miami, you don't really care about border security. It's not something that's like impacting your daily life. But when you're a Mexican American in a place like Hidalgo, Texas, it really illegal immigration can really harm the way you live, and it can jeopardize your job and your family. And the Democrats have just abandoned that position altogether. And I think that's really hurting the Democrats. And at the same time, it is true that President Trump has a very unique blue collar worker appeal that really resonates with Latinos, who really now consist of the bulk of the working class in America, and like the small business entrepreneurial class as well.
And Giancarlo, final question for you. How much of Trump's performance here do you think is duplicable for the future for Republican candidates? Or again, do you think it's unique to President Trump?
There are some aspects of it that I believe are unique, but look, I mean, as someone who I was not a Republican when I was younger, watching kind of a little bit from the outside in, it reminded me, at least back in the days, it reminded me a little bit of Judge Smales from Caddyshack. So you can't brand yourself as like going as like that party. The Republicans, I think, are now, if you just look at the demographic data and where we're getting our support from, it's clearly like a strong working class, middle class party. So we should be able to reassemble that coalition again in the future. But at the same time, we need to have pretty sophisticated messaging and understand, like you said earlier, that communicating with a Colombian American is not the same thing as when you're engaging Mexican Americans. And in fact, when you're engaging with Mexican Americans in Texas, it's different than your message in New Mexico and in Arizona. So having that messaging sophistication is going to be essential to our success in the future and our ability to reassemble this coalition and continue growing it.
Giancarlo Sopo, conservative media strategist who helped lead the Trump re-election campaign among Hispanic Americans. I really appreciate the time.